Yeah, so the beginning of this paper was actually, well, 2 years ago, I got a book into my hands, which was about ecology. And first I thought, should I really read it? But it mentioned resilience, and resilience, supply chain resilience, was my research area. So to me, it was really interesting to see what other people in other fields would do, and when they study their units of analysis or their systems, a forest and ecology, compared to supply chain in our field, in our discipline. So I started reading this book. It was from authors that are quite famous now in ecology. And I realized this is really interesting what they're doing. And this could potentially also be interesting for us in our discipline. Because the way we have defined a supply chain was also how ecologists have defined an ecosystem as something that you can control, as something that is just there, that has boundaries that you can study in a reductionist way. And in ecology, they realized over time, suddenly this doesn't really work well. So we've tried to control the forest. We've planted trees as we wanted to. And this created monocultures. This has made the forest very vulnerable. And I thought maybe this is also something we should look at in supply chains. So I tried to read more and more, and I, in the end, ended up with reading a lot of ecologists or papers from ecology, from another field, books from another field. And the more I read, the more interesting it was also for supply chains. So I read these papers and books having in mind, what could this mean for our field? And that was really interesting. That was the beginning of this journey. And yeah, the end of this journey is this article. So the traditional assumption, so if I first look at ecology, the assumption of a forest was that it is a system that can be controlled. A system where there's a designer, almost like an engineer, who is controlling how the forest should look like. And you can only do this if you assume that this system is stable. It has to be stable. If something is going wrong, let's say there's a fire, then as quickly as possible, you try to rebuild that forest because you assume there's a perfect and optimal state of that system. And in ecology, they realized this is not how a forest behaves. It evolves over time. It also makes a lot of sense that it changes over time. Let's say if the climate changes, then also different species should be in the forest. So you would make the forest very vulnerable if you just try to force it to be in a certain state. And the same, you could say, also applies for supply chains. So what are the assumptions in a supply chain? I think it's interesting to reflect for a moment that our discipline is actually two disciplines. On the one hand, you have this strong root in engineering. Think about operations research, the math model approaches that they have. So really trying to model a supply chain and also discussing optimal states and trying to achieve them. And then you have social sciences, so business thinking in our discipline, where it is about human actors, changes, complexities, and also systems that have no boundaries. I mean, we have seen discussions in our disciplines for many years now, very interesting discussions about complex adaptive systems. But you have these two worlds. On the one hand, the engineering world, on the other hand, the social science world. And my view on supply chain management is a bit that we have often focused maybe too much on one side. So we need both. It's like two hearts that we have in our body, and both of them are important, two organs that both are important. But we have focused maybe too much on one of these, and that is this engineering element. Assuming that the world is stable, that you can command and control it, and instead of using different metaphors for management. So What does it mean, the stability? Think about the subway system. Think about the New York subway underground system that they have there, or another in Berlin or in London or in Paris. And this is a closed system. It has clear boundaries. So if you, as a customer, as a user of this system, if you are in front of the map of the grids at the wall, you can see all elements of that system. You can recognize them from outside. You're not inside the system. You can see it on the wall, and you have the total overview over that system. And those who operate that system in the control rooms, they also have total control. They look at their screens, they push the right buttons, and if something goes wrong, then they try to, as quickly as possible, go back to the old state. And this is my view. If you look into our textbooks, this is also how we often depict the supply chain from outside. The raw material supplier on the left side, the final consumer on the right side, and then a network in between, but we assume that we can control it. And if we can't control it, then we just need more transparency. That's what we often say in our discipline. But this is an engineering approach, because we assume that we can control this reality, the supply chain, and that it has no boundaries and that we just have to push the right buttons. And this is the metaphor that we use for management. So the new view that I propose in the article is borrowed from ecology. It is a bit like a forest. So you assume that the forest is very big, but it's not like a bird flying over the forest, seeing every tree. It is more like you are inside the tree, inside the forest. You can see the neighbor trees, but you can't really control the entire forest. So there's a lot of different species there, and it is very difficult to have the full picture of that system. So trying to control it is meaningless, you could say. You should have a different metaphor than command and control. And this is essentially that's the beginning of this article, how or where I challenge the assumptions of our discipline and challenge the assumptions of supply chains, but also of supply chain management. Yeah, so what could be a better metaphor for management that represents management if it's not command and control, like in engineering? In ecology, you could say that evolution is maybe a good metaphor, because the tree, the forest, or even the world is changing over time and adapting to a new reality, a very slow process. But then I thought, is that really how a supply chain behaves? So a supply chain might not behave like a subway system, but does it really then behave like a forest, as I read in these books? And then I realized, okay, this is a nice new metaphor to look at evolution, adaptation, but maybe it's still not perfect. Because what is different between a forest, an ecosystem, and a supply chain? The big difference is actually that in a supply chain, we have social actors. So unlike in a forest, where we only have trees, maybe that grow because they adapt to a new reality, we also have social actors, we have human beings that can make decisions with intent, that can steer transformation. So it is not just about adaptation, it is also about adaptation in the sense of transformation. We can look into the future where we should be maybe in 20 years. And this is very important, to innovate the supply chain, to foresee future changes. So therefore, I came up with dancing as a metaphor for management, because dancing is also used, or has been used also in ecology, but I'm not sure if it really fits for a forest, because dancing is about, there are rules and you have to stick to these rules, but you can also challenge these rules. You can experiment. You're not alone, so that means you can't just command and control the reality around you or the system, the supply chain. The system also controls you, but it is a dance between you and your environment, or you and the system you're a part of as a manager. So therefore, dancing also looks at the next steps. So you can, as a manager, you can foresee these next steps, but sometimes you're also wrong. And sometimes you can also challenge the entire way, the entire rules that shaped the system that you're managing, which is the supply chain. So I use panarchy theory. This is the theory that ecology came up with to describe how supply chains evolve over time, but also transform over time. And one important element of panarchy theory is the adaptive cycle model. That is a model that was invented or proposed by Holling several decades ago, and again, proposed for how a forest changes. And what is interesting about this model is that it actually describes change in two ways. There can be a very slow type of change, where a system changes gradually and slowly. So this is the front loop of the adaptive cycle that we can see now on the screen. So slowly means you start with no relationships to other actors in the supply chain. Resources are now seen as an opportunity. So resources could be other suppliers or other actors in the supply chain. Now, gradually, the system is collecting and building up these resources. A good example might be the automotive industry. So the car was invented 150 years ago, maybe. And then gradually, over 150 years, the combustion engine developed and shaped and became better. So people optimized it. It became a better engine. But that also means the system around it, the automotive supply chain, gradually improved, and new resources were added over time. So this is this very slow and gradual type of change from exploitation, where resources are used as opportunities, to conservation, where capital is essentially accumulated. And then there's the back loop. This is a second type, or this describes a second type of change, which is a very sudden, fast, and radical development. So suddenly all these truths that are in the system, the relationships between different actors, become meaningless. So suddenly it doesn't make sense anymore to produce a combustion engine, because maybe of the climate crisis. Tesla is a good example. They looked at the climate crisis and realized this shapes how the world will look like in 10 or 20 years, also the automotive industry. So that means we can't just gradually improve the combustion engine. We have to use this crisis that is on the horizon, or that is around us. We have to use it as an opportunity to become or to gain an early mover advantage with an electric car. So they started to reinvent the way how the automotive supply chain should look like, and other companies did so as well. But this is a good example how fast and radical changes can suddenly happen and entirely challenge the way that we have looked at the world and that we have looked at the supply chain. Now, there's a second view on panarchy theory, and that is the view that there's not just one adaptive cycle. For instance, the adaptive cycle that describes the changes in the supply chain or of the supply chain. There can also be adaptive cycles for other systems, on other levels, so to say. So there's nested systems. The supply chain is part of a bigger environment of the planet or of the political, economic world, and everything is interrelated. So that means we have different levels. And this is what the second picture shows here. The second figure. So there's the supply chain level with the adaptive cycle that I have just described. So gradual changes in the front loop and then sudden changes in the back loop. But there can also be an adaptive cycle for the political economic level, or that represents the political economic level. That is much slower, and so the time horizon is much larger than for the individual supply chain. such a system might also represent a bigger meaning. So suddenly it is about the global economy, it is about political relationships between different countries and stuff like this. So these relations can also change, and they can first in the front loop build up. That can mean that capitalism has emerged and globalization has emerged over many decades. And suddenly there is challenges to this view. Suddenly people ask, does it really still make sense that we have relationships between the US and China, for example? Or should there be a circular economy instead of a linear economy? So many truths that have been or that used to be true over many decades might also suddenly be challenged. That can also lead to very quick change and reorganization of the political economic system. And then there's the climate system or the planetary level. Also this stabilizes over, in that case, even thousands of years. And then suddenly ice is melting, CO2 is emitted, and then suddenly this system changes very rapidly, or the system on that level. So that means we have different adaptive cycles, and there can be many more. There can be cultural systems, there can be group and functional levels if we zoom into the supply chain, and all these levels interact with each other. So that means what I've said in the very beginning, looking just at the metro or the subway map, the grid that we can see on the wall without looking at the environment doesn't really make sense. It's a bit like on Titanic. If you just look at your neighbors that's maybe in the dance hall, in the dance room of the Titanic, and focus on dancing, so now in a very different meaning, so you're happy, you're maybe drinking, you are talking, you are laughing, you're smiling, but ignoring the environment around you, the other adaptive cycle maybe of the sinking ship, of the big catastrophe, the much more meaningful story. If you focus too much on one system that you try to manage, the supply chain, and thereby ignoring what is around you, the political economic system, the planetary system, I think then you are ignoring too much. And I fear that was a bit how we did it in supply chain management in the last couple of decades, not always. So we have research also on stakeholders, on sustainability. But what I propose is that this panarchy theory from ecology gives us a better understanding, or at least an alternative view on the world that might enable us to describe the world in all its complexities. Or what I can see is there's 3 research opportunities that I think that might be important or that might be relevant for our discipline, that are a result of panarchical thinking. So by adopting this view from ecology, supply chain management has 3 opportunities. There might be more opportunities, but I identified also in the article then 3 themes that might be interesting. The first theme is about extending the unit of analysis. So traditionally in our discipline, the unit of analysis was, especially in engineering, with this engineering view in mind, is that you look at just the supply chain, or maybe just at a buyer-supplier relationship, as you see so often in maybe survey research. Then some years ago, we already acknowledged that supply chains are actually complex adaptive systems. So suddenly the supply chain turned into something else than traditionally, not in a closed system, but maybe in an open system, that also, where you also realize that the world is complex. And panarchy theory now goes even one step further by assuming that the supply chain is a socio-ecological system, which I think is a special case, I would say, of a complex adaptive system, social actors and behavior that is similar to an ecosystem, but then also on different levels. So you have the supply chain level, the planetary level, and the political economic level and other levels. So future studies could embrace this diversity and also look at different levels and how they interact. The second theme is about the way how we look at management. Instead of assuming management is about total control, we could assume that it is about managing in, managing out, managing up, managing through, managing beyond. So that means you are moving in this panarchy between the different levels. You're zooming in, you're focusing maybe in some studies on just one layer, but also on how you can influence other levels in this panarchy. So management suddenly becomes more than just focusing on your own system. And the third theme that I propose is about new types of relationships that are a consequence of panarchy theory. So traditionally in our discipline, we looked, let's say, we looked at buyer-supplier relationships, the contracts, the trusts, and other types of governance between them. But by having panarchy theory in mind, suddenly there can be a teleconnection, as some scholars in ecology have called it, between, let's say, families in Bangladesh, workers who work in the garment industry, and then consumers in the European Union of these products. And these people are teleconnected, not directly via contracts, as maybe traditional supply chain theory would discuss, but indirectly via adaptive cycles. So you need to zoom in and out, level up and down in such a complex system with a lot of different adaptive cycles that you could study and that you can trace and follow. So future research could look at all of these, could interview people from different areas, or could also use maybe machine learning to study all this. So I think there's a lot of new opportunities by looking at different types of relationships.